Hi, I'd like to share a very interesting experience I had as a registered dietitian with a patient in Italy. Because this case turned out to be very important to determine a possible cause of common diseases, very debilitating diseases, going from gastrointestinal problems to food allergies, neurological problems, excessive sleepiness, fatigue, skin problems, etc. So this patient was in pain since a long time, always suffering since 1999. It all started with a severe continuous sleepiness and gastrointestinal issues. It started with light gastritis, some pain every now and then, which then became more intense, then evolved into also acid reflux, and then skin started to be affected on his legs. He got a strong eczema, chronic, on his legs. All these symptoms that I'm mentioning, once they started, they didn't go away until then we found out what was the problem. But for many years, they were there, like constantly, no matter what. This guy changed city, changed job, changed diet, even style of clothing, everything. I'm mentioning that because of the eczema on the legs, but the symptoms were always there, no matter what. So I'm not a doctor, I'm not a neurologist, nor an immunologist. I'm a dietitian, so I had to study a lot to figure out what was wrong with this patient. And because of the severe sleepiness, he needed to sleep at least 10 hours per day and have frequent naps during the rest of the day to barely function. Couldn't focus, work, stay awake, and he used to fall asleep even while talking with people. Imagine now I fall asleep while I'm talking in the camera. It's incredible. Even while eating with people or in front of professors in school, it was incredible. So, of course, he underwent gastroscopy. They found gastritis. They gave him antacids, which, yes, gave good relief, but didn't solve the problem. Then he went to the Center for Sleeping Disorders, to one of the major hospitals in Rome, Italy, and he underwent a series of an extensive battery of tests to see what was wrong with him. He used to wear a device on the wrist to track certain parameters of the body for a couple of weeks, um, to wear a halter, which is a kind of a recorder which works 24 hours, of the EEG, electroencephalography. It's similar to the recorder they use for heart patients, but for brain. And he went to the hospital, slept there. They did a lot of tests while he was sleeping. So they excluded any secondary cause like heart problems or apneas, sleep apneas. They found out hypersomnia, idiopathic hypersomnia. Idiopathic means it's primary. It's not secondary, it's not caused by other diseases. Probably autoimmune, a problem in the brain in which there is an excessive daytime sleepiness, which the patient is unable to control. No matter how strong he tried to apply his will, his brain would literally shut down after a while. So he was able to understand when he used to call it the monster, when the monster was coming, but then once it was there, he simply fell asleep while fighting, and then he realized he fell asleep when he woke up later. So they told him, you got hypersomnia, we don't know what's the cause, if you want to try to control the symptoms, you have to take this drug. It was a neurological medication, modafinil. He never took it, he didn't want to, and he simply lived with his issues and feeling always sick and tired and in pain for many years. So I had to start studying autoimmune diseases to see what was going on, because I wanted to understand why this happened. What was the root cause, the cause of these problems? It's very important to ask this question to ourselves. What's causing this? Otherwise, we just cover symptoms with medications, but we are still sick, and maybe we get worse over time. And then there's the side effects of the chronic use of medications, etc. To understand what's the cause of a problem, of course, one of the main tools is to ask to ourselves, when did it all start? What happened when it started? Was there anything different than usual? Any particular issue, event, incident? So studying autoimmune diseases, it was a long time ago, so now we know more about them, but I stumbled upon hypotheses of certain researchers, articles, mentioning that a possible cause are viral infections. There are common viruses that are everywhere. Almost everybody carries them, which seems that in some people, probably in people with a certain genetic setting, so a particular combination of a type of genetic setting and a type of infection, these viruses, which do basically nothing to most of the population, in these people they cause problems, symptoms, illnesses, etc. So while doing this study, it turned out that everything started when the patient in January 1999 had mononucleosis. It's a common viral infection that we get only once in our life. It's caused by the so-called EBV, Epstein-Barr virus. So he had this severe fever, higher than 39 degrees Celsius. At that time, his lymph nodes got swollen, and then in the hospital they found out he had mono. So this mono, normally what happens in the acute phase of this infection, which almost everybody had, there are aggressive symptoms like high fever, sore throat, bronchitis. The patient also had bronchitis for 1 month. But then what happened? The immune system learns to control the virus and keep it in track. So after the acute stage, the symptoms go away, the patient heals, and everything gets back to normal. So I was suspecting that for some reasons this virus in this patient was still active. I'm not an infectivologist, so the first thing was to ask the doctor. The first doctor I was able to contact online, I was in a rush, so it wasn't an infectivologist, but I asked him, what do you know about Epstein-Barr virus? What does it mean when mono heals? Does the virus go away, or does it remain in the body forever? So he told me that the virus actually goes away, it's not in the body anymore, and he was wrong. This caused a little problem because I wasted a lot of time after this, because I discarded that hypothesis and started looking into other things. But then everything pointed back there to infections, viruses, and that mono the patient had. So I had to pull out my old pathology book, and I went through the different types of viruses when I went back to my native town where I had all my books. I remember this year I went back there and I started to go through my books, and that's when I found out that the Epstein-Barr virus doesn't go away anymore. The fact that we don't have chronically mono symptoms, it doesn't mean that the body eradicates the virus. Our body is not able to kill this virus. Once we get it, and almost everybody gets it, we carry it for the rest of our life. The only difference is that in the initial stage, when it's acute infection, which is called mononucleosis or mono, it causes symptoms. Then the immune system learns to keep it in track, and the virus goes in a kind of a dormant stage forever. And it doesn't give us any trouble anymore. So I found in this book that in certain countries, certain people get cancer because of the chronic presence of this virus in their body. Nasopharyngeal cancer and another type of cancer that now I don't remember, but that's the proof that in some people the virus is not completely inactive during the chronic stage. The immune system is not able to keep it completely under control, but it's still doing something in our body. Now, in these people in Asia, it causes cancer. But what if in other people it causes hypersomnia? So I explained all this, the history of the patient, to my cousin. She's a doctor, she's an endocrinologist, and she said, you know what, why don't you have the patient blood tested? So the patient already was tested, his blood was already tested for Epstein-Barr virus, but the standard tests, which are only able to tell if the patient had the infection in the first place, in the past, and if it's now in the chronic, allegedly dormant stage. And indeed, the tests confirmed he had the virus and it wasn't acute anymore. But they don't say anything, and they don't give any more information. So my cousin suggested that the patient should have been tested for for antibodies against early antigens of the Epstein-Barr virus. What does this mean? The virus is in the body partially detects it and produces antibodies based on the shape of certain molecules produced by the virus, certain that are called antigens. So the virus has a series of stages in its life. The early antigens aren't supposed to be expressed, it's a technical term, which means produced by the virus during the long-term chronic stage. If the blood of the patient contains antibodies that the body is producing against the early antigens of the virus later, there is a good likelihood that the virus is still active, or at least it's more active than it's supposed to be. It wasn't easy to find a hospital able to do this test. In Rome, the capital city of Italy, even in the main hospital for infectious disease, they didn't have this test. Finally, the patient was tested twice in 2 different periods. First, at a private clinic, which used to send blood samples to a very huge lab somewhere, I don't remember, which was able to test for everything. And then to a pediatric hospital, Bambin Gesù, Rome, which also was able to test it. The patient was positive both times. And then he was also tested later, many years later, and it was still positive. Antibodies against early antigens of the virus. So we assumed it was confirmed that in his case, Epstein-Barr virus was still chronically active and so possibly causing problems. The patient talked with the neurology department of the hospital where they diagnosed the idiopathic hypersomnia and presented his concerns about this virus. They were very kind. They ran a series of other tests for general health. They hospitalized him for a day. But they said, unfortunately, there's no way to know for sure, even if it's the virus that is causing these, there are no drugs because it's not a bacteria. So it's not that you can take an antibiotic and eradicate it. If the virus is the problem, there's no cure. Indeed, 95% approximately of the population carries the virus, and that's it. Mononucleosis is called at least in Italy, it's called the kiss disease, because usually the way people contract this virus the first time in their life is during adolescence when they start kissing each other, because the virus is transmitted through saliva. Indeed, the patient had a relationship in that period when everything started. So, what to do? Thankfully, there are nutritional and natural supplements. And that was my area of expertise, so I already knew what to try. And rather than an immune stimulating product, so active immunization, I wanted to try a kind of a passive immunization through natural supplements. Basically, not a product that stimulates the immune system to kill the virus, because he had already tried several immunostimulants, natural immunostimulants like echinacea, propolis, and many others with any results, but a product that directly kills a broad variety of microorganisms, viruses and bacteria. So my choice, of course, was silver. Now, the problem with silver is that it's not easily administrable, I don't know even if it's correct in English, orally. So there are medications based on silver, but for skin infections, like for wounds, when people get burned, but nothing to be taken orally. Why? Because silver easily tends to get deposited in the tissues and to become toxic, to cause a toxicity that is called argyria, which causes skin discoloration. Skin may turn gray or blue, and in case of severe poisoning, even more severe problems, more grave problems. So, after a long study of all the available natural supplements based on colloidal silver, I came to this conclusion. There is one company in US producing a very clean solution of colloidal silver, very low concentration, so there's no risk of toxicity, 20 parts per million, and produced with very expensive equipment costing millions of dollars in a nanotechnology lab, which was very important. Quality was very important. Why? Because there are even homemade kits to produce colloidal silver using silver electrodes with an electric current. But of course, you can imagine the difference of the quality of a product produced by a company using $1 million machinery compared with the colloidal silver produced with a $50 device. One example of difference is the size of the molecule. Silver atoms must be dissolved in water, double distilled water, there must be no salts in it, in a way to form tiny aggregates of a few atoms, possibly less than 10 atoms clusters, so that the particles are very, very tiny and can be distributed in the body. It seems that the bigger chunks of the old types of colloidal silvers tend to deposit in the tissues more easily and become toxic. And also the dose is much higher with those old products because big molecules, high concentration, high toxicity. While this product had a low concentration, but because the particles were small, the useful particle surface area, which is the actual total area that comes in contact with possible viruses, pathogens in the body, whatever, is higher. is the same principle as sand, or you can even make it as a big snowball. But then if you take the same quantity of snow and you divide it into many, many tiny snowballs, the total surface area is increased. Why? Because in case of the big ball, a lot of material is hidden inside. While the more you break it into smaller chunks, the more you expose the internal material externally. So the total surface area increases the effectiveness of the product without having to have a high concentration, which is toxic. But it wasn't available in Italy. Until a couple of years after we figured all these things out, a company started to import it in Italy. So the patient immediately ordered it and started taking 10 ml 4 times per day on an empty stomach 30 minutes before eating. His life changed. He got his life back. Before that, for maybe 10 years or more, he tried dozens of supplements, even supplements that are supposed to help brain energy. Every time he was hoping and sure they were going to help, nothing worked. With this simple liquid solution, which doesn't have any other property, because other than killing bugs, silver apparently doesn't have any other property. In a few days, less than 1 week, he had his life back. No hypersomnia, a complete change. An important thing to say is that it wasn't placebo. Why? Because in the past he tried a lot of supplements and he never had such a powerful effect. Only apparently feeling a little better for a couple of days, but then nothing, if that was placebo effect. And because the effect lasted forever. When he started taking silver, the problem never went back. If sometimes he forgot to take silver, then he started to during that day, slowly feel a little more sleepy until he realized, oh, I forgot to take my silver today. But other than that, keeping taking silver, he never had a problem anymore. But the virus was still there. So the silver was only able to control the activity of the virus in the nervous system because he didn't have sleepiness anymore. He was normal. He was able to do everything like every normal person. But the virus was still there because he got tested many years after and it was positive still. And also because the other symptoms didn't go away. My opinion, this happened because colloidal silver is supposed to be held under the tongue for 30-60 seconds and then swallowed. Why? Because the nutrients and the molecules we absorb under the tongue, they go straight to the brain. They bypass the blood-brain barrier. While the things that we digest through our digestive system, they are filtered by the blood-brain barrier. So, in my opinion, for the time he used to hold the silver under the tongue, some molecules, because they were very tiny, they were guaranteed with the analysis published, less than 10 atoms per cluster, less than 1 nanometer diameter. So they were very tiny. For sure, they were able to be absorbed very quickly, instantaneously under the tongue. Maybe they went immediately in the brain and they were able to control sleepiness. But when it comes to other systemic symptoms like the skin on the legs, gastrointestinal issues, well, that would have required, in my opinion, a much higher level of silver in the blood to even be toxic. But that's just my opinion, my interpretation of the facts. So, what do we have here? Hypersomnia, so nervous system issues. And his hypersomnia, I forgot to mention, also had a couple of symptoms that were more common with narcolepsy. So it was a very variegate, a very rich set of symptoms. Then he had skin issues, gastrointestinal issues, and he developed this chronic pain, heartburns, gastrointestinal issues and problems that turned out to be an allergy to gluten after many years. So as you can see, we have eczema, we have gluten allergy, we have hypersomnia, possible narcolepsy. It seems all autoimmune systems. So it seems to me that the viral hypothesis of viruses scrambling and messing up the immune system activity so that the immune system starts to attack the body itself makes sense. But unfortunately, the patient was always on silver, so he was destined to have to buy silver every month. I mean, it's expensive, and after a long time, it starts to be it's not nice to have to rely on a product to live. So going forward a while again, the patient gastrointestinal problem, always in pain, always heartburn. The patient was constantly on fire. He was told, okay, the problem with esophageal reflux is especially when you go to bed because you lay down, so the acid from the stomach, if your hiatus valve, I hope that's the correct pronunciation in English, doesn't shut correctly. It's the valve between the stomach and the esophagus. You get acid reflux. The esophagus is not supposed to receive the stomach acid, so it gets inflamed, irritated. You get heartburns, etc. And the patient was diagnosed with hiatal hernia, which is an inability of this valve to shut, to close, and to prevent the acid to get into the esophagus. The problem is that after a long time, he didn't have the hernia anymore. The stomach went back to its position. He got tested again. He got endoscopy. He didn't have the problem anymore, but he was still having heartburns. Yes, when he went to bed, it was worse, but even during the day, while he was sitting, standing, always sick. So I was told, don't eat citrus, don't eat acidic foods. That helped a little bit, but even eating plain blank stuff, I don't know how to say, he was always in pain no matter what. So I thought, wait a second, there must be something wrong here. Yes, for sure, it's caused by the Epstein-Barr virus, because everything started as a narcolepsy, hypersomnia, eczema, when he got the virus. But again, what is the virus doing? There must be some mechanism that is scrambled, is unbalanced, to make this patient always sick. One day, the patient ate a sandwich in a time of the morning when he usually didn't eat, and the symptoms got worse. So a guy told the patient before, a few days before, have you tried excluding gluten? Maybe you have gluten allergy. So this thing was kind of deposited in my subconscious mind. And then when a few days after the patient had the sandwich in an unusual time and he got sicker, that suggestion received from that guy emerged again. And wait a second, maybe it's gluten. Maybe the virus also, if the virus is able to cause autoimmune disease, it's also causing gluten allergy. It's interesting that for general health, performance, for healthy eating, the patient had already tried to go off gluten for 4 to 5 months before. The problem is that he didn't go off gluten thinking that he had an allergy. So it didn't prevent contaminations. He just didn't eat any food containing gluten. But he didn't pay attention to sharing tools, plates, equipment, or food that maybe was processed where there was gluten, even if it didn't contain gluten added as an ingredient, etc. So he was for 4 to 5 months off gluten, and he didn't have benefits. beneficial effects. He was always sick. After figuring this thing out, I put the patient completely off gluten, like a celiac person, and in a few days, all his pains were gone. Completely. He could go to bed, but of course, it took a while to get used to have eyes and attention to prevent any possible cross-contamination, because gluten is everywhere. So every once in a while the patient made a mistake, he got sick again for days. For example, once the patient ate a mineral supplement, a magnesium mineral supplement, which had written gluten-free on the label. So he immediately thought, oh, I can eat this. He got sick. He called the manufacturing company, and the company said, well, actually, we cannot absolutely guarantee that the product is free of gluten traces, because the encapsulating facility of the capsules also process gluten. They clean, but they don't have an allergen program, so there might still be traces of gluten on the equipment, which end up in the capsules, which might end up in the product. Imagine how sensitive the patient is. And many other stories similar to this. One day he got sick with cinnamon, and then the label didn't say that it might contain gluten. Then he called the company and they said, oh yes, sorry, our cinnamon can contain gluten. Only our products that explicitly say gluten-free are manufactured in a separate environment. And many other stories. I don't want to bother you with a lot of the same thing. Similar stories. So another problem, probably caused by that virus. So after many years being off gluten, every once in a while, the patient got sick when he made mistakes, then he learned not to make mistakes anymore. But sometimes a little bit of acid reflux or fire, he used to call it fire, when he went to bed was still happening off gluten. But only when he went to bed and used to sleep on the right side. Why? Because the stomach is bent and the curve of the stomach goes, toward the right. So if we sleep on this side, it's easier that the acid, it's like putting a bottle reversed. It's easier for the acid to get into the esophagus. While if we sleep on the left, as you can see, it becomes like a bowl. So the acid should go almost vertically. So it was still having some kind of weakness, gastrointestinally speaking. That's when he went paleo, on a paleo diet, so no grains at all. Because before, among other things, because before the patient was still eating gluten-free grains, such as rice, quinoa, and things like that. So tapioca, he noticed tapioca was very connected with these minor, even still with fire, but less strong than before, episodes of pain. So he went completely off grains, beans. Why? Because the main reason of paleo diet, it's because carbs stimulate insulin increases arachidonic acid level, which increases the inflammatory cascade. It's a long story. So all inflammations, allergies, autoimmune diseases gets worsened, etc. It's a long story. Cardiovascular disease, brain issues. But besides carbs, beans, legumes, grains, some vegetables like nightshades, like potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, and other foods contain lectins. Lectins are a kind of glycoproteins which can bind strongly with our intestines cells and weaken the junctures between cells and cause, in the long term, what's called leaky gut. So our intestine isn't supposed to absorb complex molecules, also called polymers, like complex carbs, protein, Now, what happens when we get leaky gut? When the juncture of the intestine cells get weakened, complex molecules can pass through. The problem with complex molecules passing through and ending up in our system, in our blood, is that a complex informational molecule, like a protein, implies genetic information from the species which produced it. Why? Because to produce these molecules, the cells of that species need to read the genetic code. Reading the genetic code at triplets, the nucleotides, it's like reading instruction books, an instruction book, and assembling pieces, like when you buy Lego. You read the instruction, and based on the instruction, which is the DNA, you take the proper pieces. There are many different pieces, different shapes, and you build that thing that you are supposed, that starship, that car, whatever, that you're supposed to build with the Lego kit. So once you have the whole car, the whole starship or whatever, that thing implies genetic information. Otherwise, it couldn't have been built by the body. Now, which is also an argument used by, and it makes sense, people that says that the universe is a creation made by a mind because there is information. But I don't want to go off topic. So these complex molecules contain expressed genetic information. Like a Lego kit, once it's nice and finished and beautiful and built, contains expressed information written in English or whatever language on the instruction booklet. When this complex, when the intestine cells junctures are weakened and these complex molecules can pass through and get in our blood and in our systems, what happens? The body sees that there is an antigen. Why is it called an antigen? Because it expresses genetic information from another species. The body, the immune system, believes, metaphorically speaking, that there is an invader in the body and needs to go to defense mode. But there are no infections. There is no real invasion. It's just an anomalous reaction. So what happens? The body attacks itself. Unfortunately, for example, in people with gluten sensitivity, like this patient is not celiac, he has non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Studies showed that the body can produce antibodies against the thyroid tissues. Why? Probably because certain sequences of the molecule of gluten are very similar to certain sequences in the structures of thyroid. So when the body starts producing antibodies shaped on the model of this intruder, which is the gluten in that case, or any other antigen in other cases, those antibodies end up attacking also thyroid. A study showed that one single exposure to a trace of gluten in a gluten-sensitive person might damage the thyroid for 6 months. And it makes sense. Why? We know how good the immune system is to produce antibodies that attack things once it starts. Normally, this is a good thing. Why? Because if we get an infection, we want the body to be able to produce antibodies for a long time until the infection is, say, surely eradicated. Indeed, what are vaccines? When we get a vaccine, we get antigens from the bug we want to be vaccinated against. So we take a piece of molecule that contains the genetic information of that bug. We take only a piece, so it's not the real thing, the actual bug. So it shouldn't harm us unless they add other poisonous things in the vaccine, but that's another story. It shouldn't harm us, but still it contains part of the genetic information of that bug. So the body starts producing antibodies using these as a model. It's like a match. So this is the molecule, this is the antibody. It matches. It's like a three-dimensional shape. So we inject the vaccine material in the body starts producing antibodies against that bug, that piece of the bug. Do we need to get vaccinated every day? No. We just get a shot, then another shot after a few months, then after a year, and then maybe you got immunized for the rest of your life. See how the immune system remembers the antigens it came into contact with and is able to keep producing antibodies for a long time, even if we are not getting the vaccine again and again and again every day. The same, unfortunately, happens with food allergies. I want to be clear. I'm not talking about these hundreds of food allergy tests that are around that tests directly the blood with the food. I'm talking about the abundantly scientifically backed main allergies, which involve the main 11 food allergens: wheat, gluten, milk, crustaceans and shellfish, other fish, etc., tree nuts, peanuts, etc. So fortunately, our immune system is good in producing antibodies and in finding tiny traces of antigens and attacking them. Unfortunately, it's not supposed to do that when it comes to food, but sometimes it does. When it does, a single exposure to the allergen, milk, gluten, whatever, and you might have problems for months. Now, for celiac gluten allergy, you have problems with your intestinal villi. With non-celiac gluten sensitivity, with brain, with thyroid, etc., with skin. It's not a coincidence the patient had also eczema. So the patient went paleo, eliminated grains, beans, nightshades, basically a Paleolithic diet. What you would eat if you were in a wild environment without any kind of technology, neither agriculture nor industry. So, wild environment, vegetables, fruits, some hunting and fishing. After going paleo, the patient, so I read a study about the 5 days fasting. I don't remember the name of the researcher. He's very famous, unfortunately. 5 days fasting and the beneficial effects of fasting on the body, which makes sense because if we think about it, our body is made for the natural environment. The natural environment doesn't have candies, food stores, and things like that, which means that our body isn't supposed to eat constantly every day without interruption. I mean, not constantly 24 hours, but every day. There must be some periods of food. Indeed, they found out that the fasting for 5 days makes beautiful things, like increases the pool of stem cells, regenerates immune system cells, gets rid of senescent immune system cells, like old ones, and produces new ones. This is very important. And also for allergies and autoimmune diseases. Why? Because there is a difference between mature and young immune cells. The more immune cells become old, the more they become specialized. It's like if they take a master and then a PhD and then a postdoc, and then they focus, they become specialized. But the more they become specialized, the more it might be, there's some data, it seems that the likelihood of developing in autoimmune diseases, if our immune system cells get old and old and old and specialized, increases. While on the contrary, young immune cells have a broader activity, are more ready to protect ourselves from infections, flu, whatever, viruses, bacteria around, because they are more ready, they are more easily adaptable to different intruders. So it's very important to have a rejuvenation, to have a turnover, to let our body get rid of all the immune system cells and produce new ones. Fasting is necessary for this. We are children of technology and progress, which is great, but the body maybe wasn't ready to eat every day. Maybe that's why we have an explosion of autoimmune diseases. We need to ask why we get sick. Why? I don't want to go off topic, just a 1 minute story. I was looking at a very interesting video about new developments in the research against Alzheimer. Alzheimer is a little different, but basically some protein produced in our brain at a certain point, for unknown reason, start to be produced with an anomalous shape. Because they don't have the shape they're supposed to have, they start to stack, to pile up with each other. When these aggregates start to become big enough, we get Alzheimer. The brain doesn't work properly, and brain cells start to die, and the brain starts to shrink. Now, they're making beautiful advancements in pharmacology, and they're developing new molecules able to get in the way and prevent these altered proteins to pile up, to help Alzheimer patients, which is fantastic. And I went to a conference. There were a few in the past. They found a few promising molecules. The problem is they were toxic, so they couldn't use them. That's the downside. When it comes to synthetic drugs, they might also carry with them unwanted effects, especially when we have to put people on them for the rest of their life. It's not like a 3 days or some flu or 5 days therapy. So it's great that we put a patch and we try to contain the damage and to address the problem of Alzheimer. But let's also ask why. Why do these proteins come out altered in the first place? Why? Why diabetes? Why arthritis? Yes, we are developing better drugs to relieve symptoms. Why does it happen? It's 50 years, for some diseases even more, that we have the same chronic disease. Not only Alzheimer and brain degenerative diseases and type 1 diabetes, other autoimmune disease, even skin-related autoimmune disease, arthritis. But why? Is it possible that in 50 years, 60 years, decades, we weren't able to find the reason, the root cause? Maybe because we gave up asking ourselves, why does this happen? And we have a lot of potential candidates around in the environment. Yes, some people with certain genetic settings are more prone to get this disease, but then they saw contradictory data also for Alzheimer. So genetic code can play a role, but it's not the only cause. Example, it's also genetic that some people get tanned very easily while other people don't. It's genetic, but the cause is still the sun. So the genetic code determines how easily or not easily the sun can make our skin darker. But the cause is the environment, is the sun. It's not our genes. So there was a famous saying from a scientist, um, genes load the gun, the environment pulls the trigger. It's beautiful, it's perfectly clear. So we saw in the very interesting story of this patient how a single common virus lurking around among people was able to start a chain reaction of events and symptoms. Sorry, I forgot to mention how how the story finished. So the patient went paleo, got rid of all grains, and then the patient did a 5 days of almost total fasting to try to rejuvenate and reset the immune system, like that researcher found out. So the patient only had 1 tablespoon of extra virgin olive oil in the evening in those 5 days. He cheated a couple of times. He had a small apple, organic, and organic vegetable broth for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Only broth, alternated with organic chicken broth. Only broth, not the actual bone broth, because that already contains protein and other things. So it was almost water with some minerals, whatever is in the broth. And some glutamine in the morning and before going to bed, even to help for energy. And vitamin C. And some liver supplements. Liver supplements actually for 2 months, let's say half before and half after the fasting. Lipoic acid, milk thistle, curcumin. After these combined series of strategies, after this synergistic strategy, the patient forgot one day to take silver and he didn't fall asleep, and then he realized. And then he stopped taking silver and he didn't fall asleep anymore. See how the numbers add up when we use science and when we ask the right questions? The patient did something very good, scientifically backed, and radical to his immune system, and the immune system was able to keep the virus under control. And by the way, during this evolving strategy, from getting rid of gluten, to decreasing carbs, especially high glycemic index carbs, to taking natural supplements, omega-3 fatty acids, vitamins, vitamin C, probiotics, to going paleo, to doing the 5 days fasting, the patient that used to get sick at least 6 times every year with flu and having to take sore throat, flu, bronchitis, and every time antibiotics, to a maximum of 11 times in 1 year, he started getting sick less frequently, more and more. And now it's more than 3 years he didn't get sick anymore. And the last time he took an antibiotic was, if I recall, in March 2013. So I hope this helps. All the best to everybody, and eat healthy, and as usual, live long and healthy. And thank you for listening.